Several friends have asked me where I come up with the recipes that we make all the time, and the truth is these recipes come from everywhere. There's lots of old family favorites or recipes that have been traditionally passed down from generation to generation. I love antique cookbooks, and prior to the pandemic, my husband and I traveled quite a bit, so we would try something in a location and find the recipe and make it our own. And the truth is, we also love to watch food TV. And the recipe that we're going to make today actually comes from a couple food travel shows that we've seen. Now, anytime I make a recipe, the first time I make it true to the recipe. I want to see what it's supposed to be by the recipe. And then after that, I can kind of tweak it, find what we liked and what we didn't, what we wanted to change or increase or decrease. And then we can kind of make it our own. That's the case with the recipe that we're making today. This is a recipe that we saw on a couple different food travel shows, and we've made it a few times, and we've decided what we liked, what we didn't, and we're going to make it our own today. So I hope you enjoy today's recipe. We're going to be making Italian porchetta.
For today's recipe, you'll want a 2 to 4 pound pork center cut roast or pork butt, whichever one you choose. You want to make sure that it does have a layer of fat on top. You'll need a 1/4 cup of fennel fronds chopped, an 1/8 cup of fresh rosemary, 2 teaspoons of chopped sage, 5 cloves of garlic mashed to a paste, 1 teaspoon of dried lemon zest, or if you want to use fresh, you'll just zest 1 lemon, 1½ tablespoons of kosher salt, 1 teaspoon of fennel seed, 3/4 teaspoon red pepper flake, a 1/2 teaspoon of black pepper, a 1/4 cup of olive oil, and to serve this you'll want some kind of crusty bread like ciabatta or focaccia. You'll want provolone cheese, and if you like pesto, this is a great dish for using pesto, but it also goes good with mayonnaise. We're going to be using fresh fennel today, and we're not using the bulb like some recipes call for. We're going to be using the fresh fronds, and then we're also going to be using fresh rosemary. And I like to pull the leaves off and kind of avoid that hard stem that's underneath. And then we're also going to be using fresh sage, and I'm going to be cutting these leaves. And this recipe also calls for a lot of garlic. I'm going to be using 5 cloves of garlic, but this time I'm not going to be smashing it to get the skin off. I'm just going to cut the big end of the garlic, and the paper is going to peel right off because I'm going to put these in my mortar and pestle, and I'm going to grind them to a paste. Now with the rosemary that I pulled off the stem, I do want to go through and do kind of a rough chop. These are pretty big leaves, and I want to make sure that I have good coverage throughout the inside of my porchetta. So I'm just going to chop these just enough to kind of break them up a little bit and make them a little bit easier to disperse. And with my fresh sage leaves, I'm just going to kind of pull these off. I'm not really interested in the stem again, but I'm going to take these, and again I'm going to do a rough chop so that I can get even disbursement throughout my porchetta. As I mentioned earlier, we're going to be using fennel fronds, so I'm just looking for the leaves. So I'm just going to pull off some, and I want to get rid of the really heavy stems that are underneath. The small ones are fine to chop up, and again I'm just going to go through and do a quick chop through these so that I can have easy disbursement. Now these are a little bit fiddly, so you may have to take a little bit more time, but go ahead and just chop them up and it will make them easy to disperse. For my fronds, I do want to make sure that I measure them carefully. I do want to make sure that I have a good 1/4 cup. Looks like I need to cut a few more. Now today I'm going to be grinding my garlic cloves into a paste. So I put them in my mortar and pestle, and I'm just going to mash and grind until they get to the consistency that I want. Now if your garlic is fresh, it will mash very easily. This has been on my shelf for a little while, so I'm going to have to use a little bit of muscle. Just keep going. Okay, so this is a lot smoother, so let's go ahead and add in the rest of our ingredients. First I'm going to be putting in my lemon zest, and then kosher salt. Now guys, this is a lot of salt. If you don't like a salty mixture, then just decrease it. Next we have fennel seeds, and you want to just kind of mix this along as you go. You do want to make sure that you are grinding up those fennel seeds. Next we have red pepper flake and black pepper, and then I'm going to add just a little bit of the olive oil because I want to start making these into not just a mixture, but a paste. And I just want to grind this until I start to see that it's well combined and the larger pieces are starting to break down. And then I'm going to add in my fresh rosemary and my fresh chopped sage. Now you'll need to continue to add in olive oil as you go along. You do not want this to be a dry mixture. You want it to be nice and viscous. So make sure that you continue to add in the olive oil so that you get a nice thick paste. This is looking really good, so we are going to set this aside and prepare our meat. Now today I'm using a center cut roast, and it did have bone at the bottom, and what I've done is just cut that away. Now it's just my husband and I, so a smaller piece of meat would be great. I do want that fat layer on the top, but I am going to cut through, and I'm going to kind of slice this. I'm not cutting the fat off, I'm cutting into the flesh, because what I want to do is basically cut this into a spiral. So I'm going to cut a flat part, cut down just a little bit, and cut the other way so that I can lay this meat flat, stuff it with wonderful herbs, and then roll it up again. So now that I've got my meat flat, I'm just going to spoon all of those wonderful herbs right onto the meat. I want to cover the inside from one end to the other. Now, as I mentioned, this is a salty preparation. If you don't like a lot of salt, cut it down by a little bit. But the salt and herbs with this pork is absolutely wonderful. And I just want to spoon all this on the inside and get a really good coverage. All of these herbs are going to make fantastic flavor. Now once I have that done, now I'm ready for my fennel fronds, and I'm just going to spread these on the inside of the pork. A lot of people don't like fennel. I'm one of those people. I absolutely love it in this dish. And I'm just going to spread it along the inside, try to get a good coverage and as even as you can. Now we're ready to roll this up. I'm going to use a little bit of butcher's twine to keep it tight, and I'm going to start at the lean end, and I'm just going to roll this up as tightly as I can. I want to make sure that this stays together while it's baking, and I want all those wonderful herbs to really come through. And when I get done, I want that fat layer on the top, and we're ready to tie this up. So now I'm going to use my butcher's twine, and I'm just going to wrap this around the outside, and I'm going to tie my knots fairly tight because this is going to shrink a little bit while it's cooking. And once I get my circular knot in there, then I want to actually move down the roast a little ways before I wrap it around the outside again. And I will continue this process till I've gotten the whole roast wrapped. Once I get to the end, I am going to wrap it around the loose ends, and then I'm going to tie it off. Now one thing that you want to do is to score that top fat layer. Don't cut all the way through, but you want to score it just a little bit. And once that's done, this is ready to go in the oven. And now that we have our porchetta all wrapped up, we want to put this into a 250-degree oven for 2.5 to 3.5 hours. Now I'm doing a small 2.5-pound roast, so I'm going to be closer to 2.5 hours. Larger roast, you may go closer to that 3.5. And you want to make sure that because this is pork, it can dry out. You want to cover it while it's doing this initial baking. When there's about 15 to 20 minutes left in your bake time, you want to uncover your roast and let that top layer start to crisp up. And then after your bake time, you want to put this under a high heat broiler for about 7 minutes. You want that top layer to get crispy. Once you take it out of the broiler, you want to sit this on your cutting board for about 15 minutes and let it rest. And once you cut into it, you will see the beauty of this porchetta. Now in Italy, this would be a street food. So you would get this on a piece of focaccia bread or maybe a fresh piece of ciabatta bread. In our household, We serve it two different ways. I love pesto, so I will use pesto as my condiment along with some provolone cheese. However, my husband is not a pesto fan. So for him, what we do is a little bit of wilted spinach with some lemon juice and salt, and we serve it with provolone and mayonnaise. Either way, it's quite delicious. I mentioned that we tweak recipes. Now, originally this recipe called for a full quarter cup of rosemary, but fresh rosemary can be very, very powerful. So we kind of cut that in half according to our family's taste. And with our experimenting with this dish, we found out that to get the full flavor, you really, truly need to use those fresh herbs. Dried herbs will work. It's delicious, but fresh herbs are better. I hope you liked today's recipe. If you would like these to continue, be sure to like, comment, and share. Thanks, guys.